gentlemen, join MythVision's Patreon not only to support us, but there are 72 videos that I did with Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald and Richard Carrier, all on the Patreon, early access. You guys can ask personal questions when I go to interview these scholars, and you're helping MythVision grow. Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald, I have a question from a patron. They're anonymous, and it goes as such. Did Christian theologians during the first 4 centuries or so develop the concepts of heaven and hell as Christians understand these places? And if so, how? Wasn't it true, for example, that Augustine taught hell was located beneath the surface of the earth? Or were these ideas in continuous flux well into the Middle Ages, as epitomized by Dante's Divine Comedy? On the other hand, the concept of purgatory, as espoused by the Catholic Church, but rejected by most Protestants, did not become a settled doctrine until the 13th century, according to French historian Jacques Le Goff. I hope I'm saying that right. With that question, if you have any insight, maybe telling us where you think heaven and hell ideas come from, because I know Bart Ehrman recently wrote a book about heaven and hell. What would you take away from this, and do you have any thoughts?
Well, images of the afterlife are almost ubiquitous in antiquity. One thinks of the pyramids, where the post-mortem reigns of the emperors and their families was going to be protected. And you have the Egyptian Book of the Dead. You have it, certain echoes of it also in the Jewish Bible, but versions of post-life or post-mortem torments appear already in Homer. One thinks of Odysseus going to the netherworld and seeing torments. And by the way, there you have both Hades and Tartarus. Tartarus is the place of punishment for the most wicked, like Tantalus, and then you have Hades. You also have the Elysian fields. A few of the mortals can go to the Elysian fields and pal around with the gods and heroes and so on. So you have various attitudes toward the netherworld. Virgil repeats these things in Book 6 of the Aeneid, when Aeneas goes to Hades and consults with his father Anchises, which is really an imitation of Odyssey 11. There is a tour of hell already in the New Testament, and this is the story of Lazarus and the rich man. And the Lazarus and the rich man is in Hades, and he's being tormented and wants to have a drop of water to cool his tongue. That's almost right out of the Odyssey, where Tantalus is surrounded by water, but he can't have any satisfaction from thirst. The notion that punishments include fire and so on goes back to Homer, but it's developed also in the myth of Ur, in Plato, and Plato certainly has notions of punishments and rewards and so on. So early Christians, and in the Lazarus story, Lazarus is in Abraham's bosom, which probably means he's reclining on the bosom of Abraham in a heavenly environment. And there's this huge chasm between him and the rich man. And you have chasms in the myth of Ur, in Plato. And I think the primary literary impulse for heaven and hell understandings are, first of all, Homer, but secondly, but not less important, in fact, more important, is Plato. In Homer, Achilles says, I would rather be a slave to a poor man alive than being king of all the dead. And Plato's Socrates comes along and says, that is not going to be a story that's going to encourage people in the military to go out and give their lives, because the greatest of all Greek warriors would rather be a slave on earth. So Socrates then gives the story of the Mythover. He has a different version in the Gorgias, but in both, hell is preserved for those who are wicked and who that desert their families and especially their country, if you will, although that's a bit anachronistic. And rewards await for 1,000 years in bliss for those who are righteous. And then there's a reincarnation after 1,000 years where people are taken to a valley where they get to choose their next dynasty, their next destiny, and they get reincarnated. This is one of the major impulses of a reincarnation in the West. The myth of Ur. It's a very, very beautiful story. We know that the myth of Ur was seminal in Judaism and early Christianity. In the Testament of Abraham, there's an imitation of the myth of Ur, where Abraham sees a vision of those who are tormented in hell and those who are considered virtuous in a heaven-like situation. You have the same thing in the Descensus Christi, where Christ goes to Hades and he empties Hades and brings everyone into paradise. So it's true that in antiquity, various cultures have different understandings of post-mortem punishment or reward. Judaism was rather famous for believing that death was the end of things. So I think we can't overestimate the importance of the Platonic doctrine that heaven and hell have to do with ethics, how you live your life on earth. And you can see it already in the New Testament. Christian Apocrypha, some Christian apocalypses talk about visits to heaven and hell that way, but it's really Platonic in my view. And the Acts of Andrew has two wonderful passages that are related to a visit to hell for those who are cannibals.
In Revelation, we see Tartarus, we see Hades. Christians don't. It's rare I've ever even heard, and if they do, they're probably Orthodox in some sense, so they see no problem with Greek connections. But from my experience, Christians have no clue and don't care to interpret it. They want to demythologize it, I guess you'd say, and give it a whole different. Well, that's the Greek word for this. It's not meaning that that's the place. Tartarus or Hades is not the place. It's the only word in Greek that can be used for this particular idea they're trying to put, and they give it a different meaning, some Jewish meaning instead, whatever that means. But here we have Revelation. What's going on in that book? That seems to be harping into the same vein here.
Or what about Matthew? The keys to the gates of Hades, and so on. No, it's just theological fudging. You know, I could give other examples of Tartarus and Hades in early Christian texts. And you're right, people try to get sidestep it and to find a Jewish alternative to it or whatever. But we need to get over the notion that Judaism was a single thing and it was a pure thing and it was theologically acceptable, whereas the Greeks were one thing and they were the bad thing, and you have social identity. We identify over here and those guys are crazy. And all of this stuff is messier. Judaism is messier. The Greco-Roman world is messier. And we need to accept the plurality or the diversity of Christian origins and see that as a gift, not as a challenge to harmonize and then to make normative. The idea of making these texts normative is really sinister, and it's had terrible social and political implications in the modern world.
One of the things that comes to mind is exactly what you're talking about. People don't know about these ideas being cosmopolitan. They were widespread, and nobody was off limits. Even the Essenes, the highly strict, we're about to go into the wilderness. If you want to even join, according to Josephus, you needed to do a 3-year commitment. I think it was, maybe it was a whole year in the wilderness. I can't remember. A year to 3 years, something like that. Where you're like, I'm going to show you why I'm dedicated to the Essene path of purity and holiness code and all these things. Even they had Hellenized ideas. Some of their writings were in Greek. What are you going to do with that? I mean, when you're most strict, what do we call that? When they're, I can't even think of the term, when they separate their kind of their own bubble, I guess you'd call them. There's a technical term. You get what I'm talking about, though. They've separated themselves.
Yeah. Segregation.
Yeah, sectarian.
Sectarian.
Very sectarian, yet they were penetrated by this Hellenism. So no matter how you want to chop it.
Well, one great example is Josephus in his Antiquities is rewriting the history of the Jewish people. Okay, so he's writing in Greek. His Bible is the Septuagint, and he's committed to telling the Jewish story. He gets to the story of David slaying the Amalekites, and the biblical narrative only says that David slew them. So Josephus wants to make that an important story. So how does he deal with this? What is his model? His model comes from Homer. And you can see it, that he's using Homer as a model for telling the Jewish story. So the idea that Judaism and Hellenism are discrete entities and they're both monolithic is simply ahistorical and pretty naive. And what we find is hybridity. By the way, often in the history of religions, people talk about syncresis, or that it's syncretic. I think that's simple-minded too. Syncresis suggests that you have two discrete entities that converge to each other and accommodate to each other. It is far less like water and oil than it is like cooking a stew. It's not two entities that merge and, have a change. It's that you get potatoes and onion and carrots and beef and zucchini and all this stuff, and you put it in and cook it. You cook it up, and it's something new. It's something different.
No matter how you want to, theologically, no matter how you want to try and approach this anachronistically in our heads, because we don't have a time machine, the point is, they weren't thinking, okay, before we come up with this idea and how we're going to connect these things, let's make sure it makes sense for people down the road so they understand where we're coming from. No, this was two cultures. Let's use an example, suppose two different cultures. One is more of a nomadic that has been, I guess comes through this process of being controlled by different empires, whether Assyria, Babylon, going all the way down into Persia. They've got probably Zoroastrian tendencies. They've got a melting pot already. Then they get controlled by the Greco-Romans, the Medes, the Greco-Romans and whatnot. And then when Hellenism hits by the Greeks, they're like, nothing new here, just new ideas that we're really starting to take in. We've already been doing that in Persia. So here, of course, Hellenism had more reach in many ways. It did more cosmopolitan ideas, I think. But so, like what you're saying, it's this big stew, and it's not, let's make this term mean this term in every sense.
Now, you can even do it with macrocultures. I'll tell you how classicists often deal with this issue. One can find parallels between the Homeric epics and the Gilgamesh epic, for example. And you find then some of those same things in the Jewish Bible. And so the question then becomes, is this indigenous to Judaism? Does it come out of a Middle Eastern environment, or does it come out of a Greek environment?
Right.
And one way of assessing it is to look for what you can call geographical identity markers. So, for example, the story of the arming of David and Goliath for that fight, mano a mano, doesn't come from the ancient world, except from the Iliad. And you can see the parallels to the Iliad, where you have this people that are arming themselves and they fight 1-to-1 and so on. So a classicist is likely to look at that story and say it is more at home in the classical world. In the Greek world.
Isn't that Achilles too? Achilles fighting the who was it? Hector.
Yeah, that's right. But so that's the most famous one, actually. But you have other examples. And the guided stone that hits him in the head. You have guided arrows in the Iliad, and so on. Another example is the story of Jonah. Do you have shipwreck stories coming out of the ancient East or out of Greece? The shipwreck stories are Greek stories. And the idea being swallowed by a fish, so it's more likely Greek in origin. But what about floods? We have flood narratives in the biblical tradition. The Greeks don't have floods. The Italians don't have floods. The Egyptians have floods, and Mesopotamia has floods. So when you have a flood narrative, you've got a geographical marker that suggests where these things come from. And of course, Israel is in the cultural crossroads between the East and West. And it's natural for them to have a hybridic mentality, which borrows from different cultures, but it's really not syncresis. That is, it's not a simple cultural accommodation. It's much messier than that. Now, to take an example of the stew, what we have frequently in the Bible is texts that are stew-like. But if we're careful, we can identify the potatoes come from here, the carrots come from here, the beef comes from here, because we have these various social identity markers. Sometimes they're linguistic. Proper nouns is a good example, where we have names that surely come out of an Assyrian background, and other names come out of a Greek background. The New Testament come out of a Roman background, and so on. But there are other markers too. So the idea of homogenizing these things culturally, theologically, is really a historical violation. It's just not the way the world works.
So just stop it.